Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to welcome all of you on behalf of Human Rights Foundation of Turkey Academy. Today is the fourth day of our symposium, and our topic is defending human rights under authoritarian regimes. The case of the children of Kavumu, a watershed moment for justice in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We have a distinguished speaker with us, Dr. Susanna Sirkin from Physicians for Human Rights organization. Welcome, Susanna. Your contribution is a great honor and privilege for us. Sexual violence is a very frequent human rights violation during armed conflicts. And unfortunately, impunity of the perpetrators of human rights violations is very common all over the world, especially in authoritarian regimes. Impunity refers to the failure to bring perpetrators of human rights violations to justice, and as such, itself constitutes a denial of the victim's right to justice and redress. Around the world, but particularly in countries where there have been mass crimes against civilians by the state or armed forces of a country, many human rights defenders work against impunity and for the rights of the victims. Impunity is one of the most prominent challenges in human rights struggle, and accountability is very critical. Unfortunately, many of the efforts do not reach to a satisfying result, which is prosecution of the perpetrators. The Kavumu case is a promising example in terms of accountability and prosecution of the perpetrators of human rights violations. Also, Kavumu case is a very striking example of collective struggle. We have constructed this session as an interview, but before we start our interview, I would like to present our speaker, Susanna Sirkin, to you. Susanna Sirkin is Director of Policy and a Senior Advisor at Physicians for Human Rights, PHR, where she has worked since 1987. She oversees PHR's policy engagement, including with the United Nations, domestic and international justice systems, and human rights coalitions. Sirkin has organized health and human rights investigations in dozens of countries. These include the documentation of genocide and systemic rape in Darfur, Sudan, exhumations of mass graves in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda for the international criminal tribunals, and documentation of the use of chemical weapons against Iraqi Kurds in the 1980s. Sirkin has played a lead role in PHR's extensive documentation of attacks on healthcare facilities and personnel in conflict zones, including Syria and Yemen. Sirkin initiated PHR's program to train doctors, lawyers, law enforcement officers, and judges to respond to sexual violence in conflict zones, initially working in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Iraq, and Kenya. She has authored and edited numerous reports and articles on the medical consequences of human rights violations, physical evidence of human rights abuses, and physician complicity in violations. Sirkin represents PHR as a member of the steering committee for the Safeguarding Health in Conflict Coalition and served as PHR's representative from 1992 to 2001 as a member of the Coordination Committee of the International Campaign to Ban Landmines. The co-recipient of the 1997 Nobel Prize for Peace. From 2017 to 2019, Sirkin was a non-resident senior fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and is a recipient of Tufts University's Jean Meyer Global Citizenship Award. Sirkin holds a BA in European Studies from Mount Holyoke College and an MED from Boston University. So, as I have mentioned, we have constructed this session as an interview. I would like to ask for my first question, Susanna. Can you tell us about PHR's program on sexual violence in conflict zones?
I would be delighted, Farida, and thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I'm so delighted to be here with all of you and collaborate with the HRFT. We have such a long and really compelling and successful history of collaboration with you all, and we continue to work together on the Istanbul Protocol and many other activities. And at this particular time in our history in the US and around the world, we very much appreciate also the incredible and critical solidarity that we need and that we have with you. And I hope we will, continue for a very long time working together to support and promote human rights. So I'd be delighted to tell you about this project and program of ours. Physicians for Human Rights has worked on the problem of sexual violence in many contexts over decades, and notably in the former Yugoslavia during the Balkan Wars, where rape was first documented and prosecuted initially as a war crime, and the elaboration of international law to press for long neglected and considered, if you will, the silent crime has evolved since then. So Physicians for Human Rights launched this program on sexual violence specifically in conflict zones in 2011. And our goal at that time was looking around the world and seeing the continued failure to achieve accountability and especially to support the survivors in their effort to achieve justice and even to speak the truth in safety and with dignity in the aftermath of both individual crimes of sexual violence, but especially in the context of mass crimes, mass atrocities. We determined that it was really critical to develop, since we're a medical organization, the forensic and clinical skills, but also the connection between health professionals, especially clinicians who are often first responders to crimes of rape and other forms of sexual violence, to work together with other professionals in order to achieve justice. And when I myself actually traveled to the Democratic Republic of the Congo for the first time in 2011 and again in 2012, also visited Kenya, these countries were also on the docket of the International Criminal Court, where governments in both of these countries had actually requested that the ICC in The Hague address these mass crimes because they were so extensive that they deserved to be prosecuted at the international level, but also with all of the resources that those institutions could bring to bear. But we also understood that actually justice occurs at the most local level and needs to occur close to the communities where the crimes occur. So we started this training project after doing an assessment, and the goal of the project is to ensure, first of all, that clinicians are able to and do conduct forensic medical exams with survivors of sexual violence, that the charts, medical charts, record these findings properly, that first responders feel empowered actually and safe to respond, and that they have a shared language between doctors, police, and lawyers. Because when we went to, and I specifically went to visit police stations, for example, in the Kivus, which is the eastern part of this very large country, the Congo in Central Africa, we found that the police had found zero value in the medical information they were receiving. On the one hand, the language of the doctors was not understood by law enforcement or the judicial process, and the doctors really had no tools to properly document sexual violence. It wasn't part of their education or their training. And this is true not only in the Congo, by the way, but in many parts of the world, including even here in the United States and elsewhere in very developed countries. This is not commonly necessarily taught in medical school or nursing school. So our goal was to coordinate across these sectors. And we had this kind of multi-sectoral approach that we used, but always with the survivor at the center. And I know this is so important as a principle also for all of you at the HRFT who have worked on the problem of torture for so many decades. If this work does not serve the needs and agency of the survivor, it is not, first of all, it's not appropriate in terms of medical ethics, and it's not helpful to advance justice and human rights in our view. So we started developing curriculum and training modules that not only trained the clinicians themselves, but also trained the clinicians together, often in the same sessions with judges and lawyers and police. And we found right away that these different sets of professionals were not talking to each other, didn't understand each other's work, really were interested in how to do this more effectively and how to collaborate. And going back to your introduction about like an authoritarian country, it may seem surprising that, you know, in a country where I wouldn't necessarily say it's 100% authoritarian, but let's say a struggling attempt at democracy, if you will, like most of our countries, there nonetheless was an incentive for the courts and local law enforcement and doctors to work together to confront this massive problem of mass sexual violence. So we had actually a great interest, not in all, but in many leaders of these actual, you know, if you will, government sectors. So there was, as it pertains to justice for sexual violence, there was some pretty strong, especially at the local level, will to collaborate among NGOs and government to achieve justice. So we started these trainings, and you can see here one of the things we actually introduced was the training of standardized patients as a method to train. So these are actually nursing students in the Congo who we trained to role play, not for the full physical exam, obviously, but to role play how to act as a patient, how to understand the trauma, and respond also to sort of signs of what a doctor or a nurse would be required to do in a proper exam. And these nursing students actually were totally engaged in this process, which was also very innovative from my experience and exciting. So we also trained in forensic photography. We were able to receive funds to provide cameras to many local doctors and clinicians. There are almost no formally trained forensic doctors in the entire country. So we were dealing really with training kind of frontline responders, clinicians, some of them specializing in sexual violence, gynecologists, but also nurses. And as you see here, I'm sure this photograph on the left is something that looks very familiar to those of you here in this symposium, having trained quite a lot and studied the documentation of torture. But this idea of taking a photograph, for example, with a ruler and looking at scars, even older scars, was very new to many of the people we were training. We also realized that there were many young children who were assaulted sexually in the context of the violence in the Eastern Congo. And so we helped our main partner, which was the Panzi Hospital, which I'll speak about in a minute, to develop a special pediatric room that was a little more inviting and a little more welcoming and less kind of scary than a normal clinical setting. And we found a local artist in the community who put these cartoon figures on the walls and so forth and painted it. And we actually received funds to support the supplies and the payment for this local artist to do this work. And it's actually something the hospital is very, very proud of, because I think that in the entire country there wasn't, at least when we started this, anything like this. So just to finish the answer to your question, Farida, in the total time since we started, about 2012 till now, we've trained more than 1,500 professionals, mostly clinicians, but as you can see from this graph, also lawyers, quite a lot of police officers, and other policy people and even journalists to understand what we're doing. And you can see the range of this project so far, mostly in Central and Eastern Africa, but also, as you mentioned, we have a project in the last 4 years in Iraq, mostly based in Erbil, because of the mass sexual violence that was carried out by ISIS, by Daesh, in the context of the attacks, for example, in 2014 against ethnic and religious minorities in Iraq, notably the Yazidi, which is considered also a genocide. So I'll stop there.
Okay. It's a very great work you have done. I should say congratulations on behalf of all the victims of the sexual violence. And my second question is, the Democratic Republic of the Congo has witnessed some of the world's highest levels of sexual violence in armed conflicts over the last 2 decades. What happened in Democratic Republic of the Congo's Kavumu village in 2013? Maybe we should say it is in the eastern part, the village is in the eastern part of Congo, and the region is very rich in terms of the natural resources, the gold mines, etc., and it has a border Rwanda and Burundi, and all the region has a history of armed conflicts, unfortunately, and this kind of human rights violations. Okay, the floor is yours.
Yes, so yes, unfortunately, and as I mentioned earlier, mass atrocities have occurred, including an enormous number of killings, estimates somewhere between 5 and 6 million Congolese died in conflict and as a result of conflict and forced displacement in the last 20 years. It's really a staggering and shocking number that's almost hard to comprehend. And of course, as you mentioned, this is a mineral-rich area, the eastern part of the country. Congo itself, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we'll call it the DRC for this presentation, is in the central part of the country. You saw it on the map here. It's a very, very large country. It's the large one right in the center there. And as you mentioned, the Kivus are on Lake Kivu, and right across the lake is Rwanda. And indeed, after the Rwandan genocide, many Hutu communities fled into the DRC, and that created additional conflict. And of course, the wars over minerals, which includes coltan, which is one of the main products for producing, our cell phones, is fought over. And at the time that this case in Kavumu occurred, there were at least 13 fighting factions in this region, very heavily armed militias moving between various entities and leaders, as well as, to some extent, an armed forces, the official armed forces that also have been accused of committing crimes as well. So the environment is first of all very under-resourced. Most people live in extreme poverty, but also live in fear, constant fear. So this village of Kavumu is not far from Bukavu, which is the capital of South Kivu, and it is not too far either from Panzi Hospital, which is the very well-known hospital of Dr. Denis Mukwege, who received the 2018 Nobel Peace Prize. He's a very well-known gynecologic surgeon who has treated thousands of victims of sexual violence. This village is very poor, and most of the houses are just these little wooden structures with corrugated metal on the top. Most people there live minimally through agriculture, but again, there are militias around, and it's not a very secure area. And what happened in 2013 was at the hospital, at Panzi Hospital, which is about 30 to 40 minutes drive on quite poor roads, I would add, from this village of Kavumu. These little children started to arrive at the hospital, some of them as young as 18 months old, others were up to 11, the age of 11, and they all came to the hospital with the same story. The story was often, usually brought by their parents or other relatives. The children were abducted, kidnapped in the middle of the night from their home, one of those little wooden structures. Some allegations were that maybe they were drugged so that they wouldn't scream. The doors are not very secure. If people are sleeping, somebody could come in fairly easily and quietly remove a child. They were taken to a nearby field. They were brutally raped. Also, sometimes their genitalia were mutilated. And then they were left. They were just abandoned in the field, often bleeding, some of them near death. And the injuries sustained by these children were similar. And the stories kept coming every few months, every few weeks, another story like this. It was truly shocking. And between 2013 and 2016, in total, more than about 42 little girls from Kavumu had come to Panzi Hospital. And in a way, thanks to the training that we had been providing, each of these cases was forensically documented in quite a lot of detail. And so at least as these cases mounted, we were working with our Congolese partners and doctors to at least obtain the forensic documentation, not knowing what was going on there. At the same time, of course, we and Dr. Mukwege, who's shown here on the left, made as much noise as we possibly could about these atrocities. We were truly shocked. We went to the media. We went to the national government in Kinshasa, which, by the way, is more than 1,000 miles to the west, and so people have no real connection to the east from the capital. But we brought it there was a special representative of the Prime Minister on sexual violence. We brought it to the UN, and really nothing happened for many, many months, years actually, and yet I wrote an article, I did this column for CNN, etc., but we could not really achieve any serious investigation. And so what happened was, and also, by the way, there was a lot of tension within this village of Kavumu. This was the city hall. There were a lot of problems with corrupt justice officials, so that the citizens of Kavumu, whose children were being attacked in this way, and the community leadership were threatened, were rebuffed, turned away at every step as well. So there was a problem not only with the attention politically to this case, but also with the local justice. And so what happened was PHR and others organized a task force. And the task force involved Dr. Mukwege and his hospital, a Geneva-based legal organization that you may have heard of, Trial, community activists, the UN peacekeeping force human rights component, the MONUSCO, which is one of the largest peacekeeping forces in the world. And they started meeting monthly to share information, documentation, what they could learn from the police, pushing the local police to do an investigation, etc. And eventually, the information, supported the notion and the evidence that a local militia leader, who was actually a member of local parliament, was responsible allegedly for these crimes. And so we started pulling together the evidence, working closely with the police. As I mentioned, these medical evaluations were conducted, and PHR, this is Georges, who's here in this picture with the glasses. He's a police expert investigator who used to work with UPOL and is a consultant to PHR now for many, many years and has done a lot of training of the police. He started working with the local police on their investigation to Kavumu. And I think, frankly, given the atmosphere of fear in this environment, with a local militia leader who's also a member of the local parliament, having international collaboration and somebody like Georges helped give kind of strength and support and even perhaps a measure of protection to the local investigators who were looking into these crimes. And of course, we're working in a village with a lot of vegetation, trying to understand how these crimes could have occurred in the middle of the night, etc. And again, also our medical expert advisor Muriel, who's from the UK via France, also participated in supporting the investigations. And I'll stop there.
Okay. Very, very dramatic, and I cannot find any word to say for the tragedy that have been occurred. I would ask for you the role of the Panzi Hospital, although you have mentioned a bit, and Dr. Denis Mukwege, who is a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2018, and his colleagues, their role is very critical in diagnosing, documenting the evidences and the treatment of the sexual violence survivors. You have mentioned the initial role of Panzi Hospital in Kavumu case, finding the same pattern of the applicants of the young children, but how PHR collaborated with them in the process, if you would like to add anything on this purpose, and what other partnerships did you have? Because it's a very great work and it's a very difficult task in an authoritarian regime, in such a difficult situation. How did you all work together? Maybe if you want to add anything.
Yes, thank you. And I know maybe I jumped ahead on your question.
No.
Answering a little bit, but this is again Dr. Mukwege. His role, in a way, was speaking out as a global leader, and he had a global voice. But also as the director of the hospital, and especially having established a sexual violence clinic at the hospital, his encouragement and support of this case as a priority case was also very helpful. Of course, Dr. Mukwege himself and his surgical colleagues did a lot of the immediate emergency medical response to these cases, because these poor children had, terrible traumatic injuries. And unfortunately, some of the children, and I am quite aware of the details of some of the cases, unfortunately, they sustained damage to their bodies that will make them permanently unable to bear children in the future. And also there was incredible psychological trauma, as you might imagine, to these children. And so Dr. Mukwege's leadership and his speaking out, as well as supporting the work of his own staff, was critical. These evaluation documents on the right, which we created like a standardized form, was something that we had done with Dr. Mukwege and his staff for years before the Kavumu case. And it was, in fact, the result of having a standardized form used again and again and again that enabled the case, which I'll speak about shortly, to be developed as a mass crime. I think the leadership of Pansy was critical. But in addition, as I mentioned, the collaboration with the local police, the collaboration with the UN peacekeepers and their support was also essential. And honestly, to some degree, the MONUSCO presence allowed for safe transport, for example, with the UN vehicles occasionally back and forth, again, in the face of threats and intimidation by the followers of the alleged perpetrators, we believe. And then the work of Trial International, the legal experts, was critical because we're not a legal organization, even though we work in the context of the law, but the role of Trial, working with the Congolese lawyers and judges, was absolutely critical as well. So we can move to the next question.
Okay. So one aspect of this effort is the building trust and cooperation with the local community. It is a very critical issue. Would you like to share your experiences, how the local community reacted to your efforts and work? Were they open to collaborate?
Yes, it's a very important question, and I think a number of things. I mean, of course, there was fear in the community. As you can see, we'll talk about the trial maybe in a few minutes, but this is not a huge village, but I mean, it does have a little town hall and so forth, but basically the entire community and the surroundings were engaged and involved in a way in the all of the aspects of this case, and there was an enormous amount of attention. And of course, the UN getting engaged as well, because this was a MONUSCO kind of a truck here, made it even more visible. But I think the solidarity that we had with the community was developed slowly and carefully over time, where we were very careful to make sure that at every step, the families were involved and informed, the local community leaders were involved and informed, that we were able to listen to their concerns, some of which involved security, some of which involved the local politics. And at every step, there was just constant communication. And we needed to understand the real fear that this community lived in. And then, of course, I'll get to this in a minute, but a range of protections for these children and the prioritization of their treatment and their survival, as opposed to just thinking about, we're going to do this big case for international law and so forth, which of course is important, but the priority, again, going back to the survivor-centered, has to be the needs of the community. And also understanding their financial situation, because the family is very, very poor, and even just transporting a child to the hospital costs money. So we needed to figure out how to raise the funds to enable justice to occur without it being a huge hardship for the community. Also, multiple languages. We had to speak in and have interpreters in many local languages, because there was a range of languages too. That was also a way to establish trust and to explain also what the purpose of a trial would be. And there was a great fear, because one of the problems in the DRC is people might be convicted, but they might not be imprisoned. They might break out from the very insecure prisons. And so the community did not trust the justice process or system at all. And we had to deal with that.
So, as you have said, now we came to the era of the trial. Kavumu trial marks turning point for justice and accountability. As we know, the leader of the perpetrators was a local member of the parliament. Can you please tell us about the trial of the perpetrators?
Yes, so I'm about to show you some very dramatic images of this trial. First of all, what was really challenging was that the local justice system simply did not have the interest, will, or capacity to prosecute a complex case like this. And interestingly, this may be interesting for you in Turkey and for us in the US, the courts that are best equipped to handle these kinds of cases in the DRC are the military courts. And that's partly because there are judges in the military courts who have been trained, interestingly, in international criminal law, and especially in the Kivus, this province of the DRC, because the crimes have been so enormous and constitute, in many cases, crimes against humanity. And so the military justice system is charged with prosecuting these mass crimes. And there have been some incredibly committed judges and lawyers that we have worked with already over some years. So what was interesting in terms of framing the case was that we looked at these individual cases, as many as 42 kidnappings, sexual assaults, rapes, and mutilations of little girls, multiple violations of a very serious nature committed in a series with the military lawyers and PHR and also some UN expert legal analysts. We were able to enable the prosecution of this case by a military court, what's called a mobile court, where instead of people having to come to a big city, which would be impossible in this environment, the court comes to the people. That's what there's a tradition of that in the DRC, especially because it's such an enormous country. And we were able to support through the law the prosecution of these series of cases together as a crime against humanity, which is very unusual, never been done before. So getting to the actual case, the trial was in this local town hall place. It was packed, as you can see. There was a lot of preparation, which I'll show in a minute, for the trial in terms of the investigation. There were, first of all, after the initial investigation, the court indicted this leader, Batumika, who had immunity, but his immunity was removed by the military court, by the judges, because of the level of the crime. Even though he was a sitting member of parliament, the judges determined that he should and could still be prosecuted. And the 11 militia leaders, they were indicted and charged with crimes against humanity. And this is the leader, the man in the blue and orange polo shirt, standing before the court. The evidence that was gathered was extensive, and this had occurred for many, many months with the police investigators and also with PHR's police investigators' support and the MONUSCO. But for example, in addition to the physical forensic evidence that came from Panzi Hospital and their doctors and nurses, there was a collection of the cell phones, which had a lot of evidence of communication among this network so that they could be prosecuted as a criminal network. Also weapons, knives, machetes, guns were seized. And here are the judges, the military judges, examining the evidence. And then we did a lot of work. Is this a question you're about to ask me, or should I continue for you to? On witness protection.
Witness protection. You can go on,
okay.
Please. Yeah.
So one of the things we were very concerned about, obviously, as I mentioned, is the safety of the participants in the trial. And most importantly, we arranged, and again, this was new and had not been done in the Congo before, that these little children would not have to appear in court. And so instead, the judge allowed for videotape testimony conducted with the families observing, but also a psychologist in the hospital that would be used as evidence in the court, so that none of the children ever had to appear in the court. And it was done very, very delicately and carefully. And in addition, other witnesses, like these people here who are observers or family members, were covered from head to toe in this way to make sure that they could not be recognized in the court. And in addition, they were kept, other witnesses and even some of the legal support who had security concerns in the community were kept behind this screen so that they couldn't be seen by the indicted or residents of the village. So I mentioned the ICC, then the laws, and this is one of the lawyers actually holding up the Rome Statute, which is the underlying statute of the International Criminal Court. What's very interesting here, again, is that the DRC has what they call domesticated the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So the same definitions, for example, of sexual violence, of torture, of killing, as well as legal procedures that are in this Rome Statute of the ICC also apply in the Congo. And so many of these lawyers, as I mentioned earlier, have been trained in this. So that was very important. And in the end, after 3 weeks of trial, there was this landmark verdict, and Mr. Batumike sitting there in the front with the 11 militia leaders were convicted, sentenced for crimes against humanity, and sentenced to life in prison.
It is very impressive that you have worked intensively over the years to make sure that the justice processes assure the security, dignity, and the best interest of the victims and their communities, and it is really very impressive. So I will go on to my last question. The Kavumu case is very critical in terms of revealing the truth, access to justice, non-repetition of the violence, and healing of the trauma. It is a success story. Can you please tell us what were the main challenges you have faced and what have remained as a lesson to human rights defenders?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good question. I think I've covered a lot of the challenges. Training and capacity, political will, security, the ability of the survivors to obtain proper forensic documentation, the trust of the community with both international and local actors, the challenges of organizing a whole network and collaborative response in a very difficult environment, the time. You know, we had to have a lot of patience and persistence. I would say for me, this was the biggest lesson. As we all know, justice comes slowly. And yet we felt this urgency because every time a new case came to the hospital, Dr. Mukwege would just like tear his hair out and he'd say, this literally was so traumatic. Not only, of course, it was mostly traumatic for the community and these poor children, but also for everybody involved in the case. It was literally overwhelming. And I remember having these agonizing conversations where Dr. Mukwege would call me up and he would say, what, you have to do something. This is going on again and again. We have to stop it. And we didn't know how to stop it. But what was fascinating also and very important is that the minute that Mr. Batumike was arrested, the crime stopped. So one lesson learned for me, which is so obvious, is that, these cases are not just about transitional justice or some future justice for past crimes. When you can work like this, sometimes you literally can, by justice, stop the crimes in their tracks, which is what happened, but it took 3 very long, horrible years. I think we also learned how important international advocacy and even media was. It wasn't until the media started writing about this that we finally got the government at the national and local level to pay attention, because the media forced the case, if you will, as well as many of us speaking out in international meetings where it was embarrassing for the government to hear about this case. So I would say at the end of the day, also the challenges are financial. As you could see from all the effort here, a lot of money went into doing this case. And unfortunately, there are hundreds and hundreds of cases like it. And one question I have for myself, for PHR, for anybody working in this space is, what will it take to do every case like this? I mean, we think that we have achieved some capacity development, some new innovative solutions to a range of issues, including technical and legal, and also witness and victim protection. But at the end of the day, these kinds of cases require huge investment. And that is not happening yet in so many countries around the world. I will say one other final thing about this, that this is not over. And for those of you who are working in these sectors and who are thinking about survivors first, just because these people were prosecuted doesn't mean that the problem is over and solved. And there's enormous trauma that remains. PHR and Dr. Mukwege and others tried to write about this so that the global community would know about it. And also right now, this is the most interesting, newest thing. This is just a few weeks ago. The Pansy Foundation, which supports Dr. Mukwege's hospital, a Pansy hospital, has invested in building 42 new houses for the families of these survivors, because we know that there is a lot of physical harm and economic hardship that these families have suffered. So part of the reparation, if you will, which is needed, which will include lifelong medical and psychological care for most of these children, and for so many others in the country and in the world, is the next step after the trial. And it's part of justice that we're very committed to. And it's wonderful to see this picture of Dr. Mukwege opening this door for one of these houses just a few weeks ago.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And we have to add, as I have searched about the case, I have seen that also Dr. Mukwege was threatened with death, and he and his family, because of his tremendous work in Pansy Hospital, and especially with the victims of sexual violence, but he didn't give up, as far as I have written. Maybe you would like to add some more about this?
Yes, he's a very courageous man, and he continues to work and live and treat people in his hospital and speak out for justice in the DRC and around the world. And he did survive already an assassination attempt in 2012. And when he left the country after that, his bodyguard was killed in front of his house when he and his close friend and bodyguard were leaving their vehicle. And so that was one issue that already happened, 8 years ago. And then just in the last few months, he has received threats and intimidation on his social media and on his cell phone, him and his family. Largely, we believe, because he continues to speak out for justice, including criminal prosecution of all of those who are responsible for these crimes in the DRC over the past 2 decades, both killings and sexual violence. And it's a very tense environment. It involves multiple countries. Some of these countries also have leaders who are very threatened by the prospect of true justice in the aftermath of these atrocities, because the militaries of quite a number of countries are possibly implicated in the crimes, according to the UN and many other NGOs who have reported on these crimes. So Dr. Mukwege understands it, and this is the most interesting lesson of all to me and most inspiring, and includes what you all are doing at HRFT, is that he understands that a doctor is responsible for the full health and well-being of his patients or her patients and their community. And that includes advocating for justice. Because as Dr. Mukwege has said repeatedly, he's not treating survivors of rape to send them back to a world where they're going to be raped again and again and again. The only way to stop that, in his view and our view, and I know your view, is to work for justice.
Yeah. I would like to thank you a lot. I don't know how to express my appreciation on behalf of Human Rights Foundation, the rich and informative and sincere experience sharing. We appreciate a lot, and we wish success in your future efforts in human rights struggle, and we will collaborate for sure in human rights struggle.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, all of you, for participating, and we're just so honored to be connected with the Human Rights Foundation and all of you in this struggle together. We have enormous admiration for the work that you do. We have learned so much from you. I know that in the weeks ahead here in the United States, we're going to have some big challenges, and we hope you'll be here in solidarity with us as we continue to deal with violence in our own cities, and also a lot of discrimination and challenges. I hope that we will continue many, many decades. After I'm retired, the next generation will carry this forward. And thank you again for inviting me and enabling us to speak about this case.
Thank you very much, and goodbye, everybody. Thank you very much for listening to us, and also we thank very much to our interpreters and also the technical colleagues who made this meeting possible online. And good afternoon, good night for us, and have a good day in States, Susanna.
Teşekkür ederiz.